Hi, I'm Agree,
I'm Harrison.
and this is Bottom Line Design. And today we have on Eli Woolery, who is a low-key, high-key legend in the design community. And for those of you who don't know about Eli, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I like low key, high key. I don't know if I've ever encountered that descriptor before, but that's good. Yeah, I'm Eli. I co-host the Design Better podcast. Teach product design up at Stanford for the past 10 years, and yeah, I've spent a lot of time at kind of the intersection of design and entrepreneurship and startups.
Amazing, amazing. So tell us, there's so much to get into. It almost it almost feels like it's like untangling like a Gordian knot,
And you're
right?
being very modest with your intro, by the way.
Yeah.
I don't want to bore people, so we'll start there.
Fair, fair. Well, why don't you start with actually what aspect of design are you teaching at Stanford right now? Like where does your like education practice really like focus?
Yeah, so I teach in the product design program, which recently got sort of redesigned itself and rebranded as just design. So historically, the program started back in the late 1960s in the mechanical engineering department. So as you might imagine, very focused on physical product design. Digital product design wasn't so much of a thing back then. And over the years that shifted, and I would say since I started teaching, 10 years ago, there was a split in the student project. So the students come up with a capstone project over the 2 quarters, and it's of their own choosing. It could be a physical product, digital product, could even be just an experience or something else that's designed. But in any case, the shift happened where when I started, I would say is maybe 70-80% physical products, 20% digital. And then that over time, that kind of flipped. And the interesting thing is this last year, it kind of flipped again. So the majority of the students were working on physical products. And I think yeah, my hunch or hypothesis is that just the students live in such a you know online world overall that they just want to do something tangible. They want to have their hands on something. They want to experience like what it's like to develop a physical product. So anyway, that's what I've been observing. And the program itself, it's very focused on kind of human-centered design. This idea that to design good products, you need to be able to interact with the people you're designing for and understand their needs and where they're coming from and their challenges. Again, in the 1960s, this was sort of a novel idea. Like engineers back then really thought more about the object and how do I design a really good object, one that can withstand X amount of forces or work underwater or whatever in space, whatever the case may be. Less so about the human factors, but this was the first program really of its kind to really focus on human factors in design, and that's still kind of the core of what we do.
So there's a question that popped in my head as you were explaining the intellectual history of the program. Which is that you mentioned how your the focus has shifted more towards human-centered design, right? And like how before that the engineers were focused on the design of the object.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in your mind, because I know you've written extensively about design theory, obviously think about it like quite a bit, have depth of thought like there. Do you see design as the subset of engineering that interfaces with like the human component,
Hmm.
uh, or do you actually see do you see engineering and design as separate disciplines?
Yeah, I think it could be really either. I mean, certainly design and design engineering. I was a design engineer for a number of years. That is a subset, technically, of a mechanical engineering discipline. But when you talk about design more broadly, obviously it sort of depends on what you're talking about designing, whether that's a digital interface or a bicycle or a fishing rod or name whatever type of object or experience or the type of thing that you're trying to design. And so I don't think intrinsically they have to be separated. In some cases they're very intertwined. And I think I would say a lot of very good designers that I know have some amount of education and experience in both the sort of more technical engineering side as well as maybe the more human centered and also aesthetic side of design. That's something else I could talk about because I think there's an important component there about aesthetics and design. But yeah, I don't see them as either uh, totally separate or totally together. Kind of depends on the context.
It's funny, like hearing you speak about HCI because at RISD when I was there, like there was there was a huge gap between digital product design and the industrial design department that I was in.
Hmm.
And oftentimes I found myself not really being able to focus in class because it was just in pure industrial design.
Hmm.
And it was, I had a lot of resentment and guilt and shame actually trying to force feed myself industrial design as it's classically taught,
Yeah.
when really the only thing I was interested in was designing interfaces for this new thing called the iPhone,
Hmm.
and the professors weren't really supportive. Do you find that maybe something is happening in the realm of like sound design, AR, VR, you know, because today digital product design is the norm at schools,
Hmm.
but maybe there's some kids out there that are like not being taught that next gen design, those next gen design disciplines.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting topic, and I think it's one that honestly I think our program has struggled with over the years. You know, what is the core audience essentially that we're teaching to? What are the students interested in? What are the skills that they should have when they graduate? And because, at least where we are at Stanford, it's a liberal arts institution, the students have a very kind of breadth of core classes they need to take. And so we're really only teaching them for the last 2 years of their career. And so we have kind of a limited amount of units that we can take over within our major and, expose them to the kind of things we want. But I think, in my mind, the thing that we can do is equip somebody to come out of the program and be able to learn any kind of design that they're interested in, right? And there's some core kind of fundamental principles that we talked about, the human side of things. But there's also, I think, and this is something honestly I think we've missed a little bit in the last few decades, but there is an aesthetic component to design that I think is important. There's some other things too. So I think what we're trying to do with the program now is we've sort of divided it into these different verticals where students can focus on design for digital products or design for physical products or sort of the more research like UX research oriented types of design. And so that tries to kind of address that a bit. But as you mentioned, there's these new technologies coming out where what is design going to look like in 5 years or so when AI
Yeah.
is more capable than it even is right now, and it's already doing amazing things. What is that going to enable for our students? So I think, yeah, we're trying to constantly evolve, but there's some core principles that we try to have the students leave with.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it's interesting, to hear you talk about they have this core curriculum and then there's only so many credits that you can take away from that. There's been so much focus on STEM, but back again when I was at school, I teamed up with John Maeda and Richard Saul Werman to do like STEM to STEAM.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that STEAM is actually picking up steam?
uh, I hope so. I mean, that part of it I can kind of relate more to my kids' experience in elementary school. Now my daughter's in middle school, and it seems like there is a pretty good emphasis on the A part of that equation, the art side of that, because I do think it's core and it's important, and relating it to our program. When I went through the program back in the '90s, there was a real focus on art, essentially design. Design is it sort of like it falls under the umbrella of the arts, and the core kind of professor taking that over was his name was Matt Kahn, and he was trained, very much in the kind of the Bauhaus school of
Oh
education,
yeah.
where there's these sort
Oh,
of design fundamentals that you should know and these different processes,
right.
and I think sometimes that was a little painful to go through, but it was also very helpful, and I came out of it at least I wasn't like an expert in typography or anything like that, but at least I understood some of the the fundamentals and what you should know or where to learn more. So that's that side of things I think is really important. And as we look forward toward what does human creativity look like in the age of AI, I think a chunk of what we're going to become is sort of editors and curators, where we're
Yes.
having AI execute things for us, but we have to have the aesthetic kind of knowledge and the technical knowledge to be able to edit those things, and also the human touch to create things that aren't completely soulless. So yeah, I think that A part of STEAM is important, very important.
And so then like what what recommendation do you have for someone who maybe they aren't able to get to Stanford's design department, but they want to learn about design? Like how would you recommend somebody enter into teaching themselves a discipline?
Hmm. Well, first, I think there's any number of programs out there that are really good. It's not just Stanford that's taking kind of a multidisciplinary approach to design, but if you're, let's say, outside the sort of confines of higher education, and we could even have a debate about whether that's appropriate for everybody. Like, I don't think college and 4-year college or grad school is right for everyone, and there's other ways to become educated and be really successful. But you know, there's a wealth of free online stuff obviously out there. There's also free courses that you can take through Stanford and other places. These MOOCs, they call them. Forget what it stands for, but essentially open online courses. And so again, the job would be for you to sort of like experiment, but also kind of curate, identify people that you think are worth following and are skilled. Um, we spent a portion of my time in my prior job at Envision was building up this library about sort of design education that was fundamental, and it was a little more oriented towards folks who are at least in not necessarily mid career, but maybe have been working in the field for a little while, and they want to elevate their design skills, but also elevate design within their organizations. They might be somewhere where design isn't valued. So a lot of what we were building was like help you, spread design thinking and embrace of design, and design as a strategic value over an organization. And I think what you're talking toward is maybe more of a junior designer or somebody who's just entering the field, and like how should they get grounded in the basics. But
Mm.
I think there's like lots of great folks out there. I'll mention one who we just had on our show recently. He runs a site called Shift Nudge. It goes by MDS, and it's essentially a UI course, but it's just very well done and well produced. And if you're just like trying to get into the basics of sort of visual design and UI design, that's a really great one to check out. If you're a little further along, if you want to learn about things like design systems, there's a guy named Dan Mall who developed something called Design
It's
Systems
the guy. Yeah.
University. It was
Awesome.
amazing. We just had him on an AMA. So we're kind of, in some ways, we're moving away from this institutional approach where somewhere you go somewhere like Stanford to get education to more of, it's a little more fragmented, but identifying individuals like the folks I mentioned who are very skilled and also good teachers, but can help you kind of get a grounding in the basics of some of these things.
Wow. So I mean, okay, this is a question. This is a very natural opportunity then to ask you a question that we sort of like were wondering going into this, which is
It's
it
a topic that's visited between us
yeah,
quite often.
quite often, pretty much since we met, which is like how you mentioned like at Envision when you were there helping out like set up this library on design education.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like a lot of it was also for stakeholders, not just people who we're going to be doing the designs, but
Right.
sort of collaborating or consuming.
Yep.
Um, it, it, the thing that we've observed is that it seems in the last decade, especially as more and more of our lives are being ruled and governed by interfaces, that the world is becoming, or people are generally becoming more like design awakened or design aware.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and as that happens, that people realize that like design is its own sort of like invisible matter or like an invisible kind of like force that can coordinate, orchestrate, structure, frame all these things. Do you think that as design's role in our lives is growing, that the design discipline itself will grow as something distinct, similar to engineering? Or do you
Mm-hmm.
think that it's actually going to become more like an underlying pillar or a principle that gets embedded across all disciplines, the way like, say, empathy or good communication would be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it might not be an either or, right? Like, I think there's an opportunity for design to become, like you said, just every discipline to become more design aware, to have access to tools, that help execute better designs. We already touched on this idea of AI, and AI as a co-pilot, and I imagine AI, to some degree playing that role too. And then there's also, I think, going to be opportunity for specialization in design careers as we go forward, where you can find yourself very deep in a discipline that's pretty design centric and still offer a lot of value. I think it could really go both ways at the same time. Um, I think in the opportunistic scenario, in my mind, is that I'll frame it in kind of the reverse. So I feel like I have a pretty extensive background in design. I've dabbled in, or at least dabbled and or worked in a lot of different mediums, from physical to digital to print, etc. Along the way, I have gained some technical knowledge too, but I'm not a developer. I've never sat down and like worked on an app, front end and back end, all the way through. But with AI now, I feel like I could essentially do that on my own with my design
Yeah.
skills, plus ChatGPT and other tools. I could build an app end to end. And so, to me, I think the optimistic scenario is whichever side of the equation you're on. If you are a designer who's maybe less technically skilled, you can use these tools to develop a product. Or if you're a developer that has less of a design foundation, you can do the same. So I think there's sort of a democratization of creation in a lot of ways, and it could go the other way too. I think we could discuss like the problems that these tools could cause too. But I think, to me, there's a lot of opportunity as well.
Oh, for sure. I mean, in that sense, it actually feels a lot like writing, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
you can imagine there was probably like some turning point, maybe around like Gutenberg time, roughly, that like knowing how to write well suddenly gave you a massive asymmetric advantage.
Mm-hmm.
That like 50 years prior, like best shot that you had was you'd be doing like illuminations in a monastery somewhere.
I mean,
No.
there's accounts of like slave owners finding out that some of their slaves knew how to write.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, and
And
that was like a
that
huge
was like a
like
huge no-no,
Yeah.
you
because it was
know?
so
Yeah.
Yeah.
empowering.
But secretly they would employ these slaves, and then during the day, it's like they weren't human anymore suddenly.
Yeah.
But, to the slaves themselves, they were able to coordinate,
Mm-hmm.
maybe coordinate an escape plan, maybe coordinate. So this topic of, is design a discipline, or is design something that we can build up in all of us as just as an ethos,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like, I'd love to hear more on, where is it that, your common, like your average tech startup founder, you know, maybe they're not finding themselves in Figma, or if they are, it's just in the commenting section. How else are they supposed to touch design for the very first time?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways. I mean, one thing is thinking about the different sort of components of design. If we think of it also, like you mentioned, empathy before, and understanding your customers or your users, and talking to them and doing that kind of research work, and that's certainly a part of design that maybe is overlooked by certain types. If you're especially very early on in like the process of starting a company, I think you know backing up to my own experience, I went through kind of a startup accelerator. It wasn't like YC. I know you mentioned a good chunk of your audience is coming through YC. It was a very different setup where you apply as an individual and they hook you up with a team, and then you go work on business problems with some funding. And it also had as its sort of foundation this design thinking approach. And while it was an interesting experiment, I think in some ways it was flawed, because if you're starting without a real understanding of the problem space, and as you both know, being in the startup world, I would say the majority of successful startups start from a place where the founders understand the need. If they haven't experienced it themselves, they're very intimate with, let's say it's a SaaS tool or more of a, enterprise tool. They kind of understand the problem or the technical problem, versus like going out and doing research and talking to people and trying to come up with an idea, which is sort of what this program was trying to have us do. I think it's tough, for a number of reasons. One is if you're going out and kind of like looking for problems, you're probably not going to be as intrinsically passionate as if you had encountered it yourself, right? And we're trying to
Right.
essentially build something for yourself. I think that's the way a lot of really successful products start. That said, once you have those first few iterations and you're building for an audience outside, like yourself and your friends, going out and talking to people and understanding like how this product fits into their lives becomes very important. Um, and that goes beyond just obviously the UI and interface part of it. And then, I guess in a less Im- impactful way too, maybe you could, as more of a technical co-founder, get a bit more oriented just around the basics. I know there's little like email courses around this. I'm blanking on the name, but just kind of the design fundamentals around typography and things like that. It'll just make you more informed when you're giving feedback to your designer, if you have a designer on your team at that point. So yeah.
Yeah, I always tell founders like during some of these discovery calls, like if you're design curious, because a lot of these guys they just don't know about design right off the bat, so they
Mm-hmm.
come to us and we help shepherd that process along. And I always say like pick up two books, one any Edward Tufte book,
Mm-hmm.
any Edward Tufte book, and then Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things. And I almost feel like it's like Don Norman will satisfy the emotional side and Tufte will satisfy the logical side, and
Yeah.
together you'll have a wise mind around design for the very first time.
Yeah.
You know,
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then my sort of like weirdo bizarre recommendation on top of that is like go to Amsterdam or Tokyo
Mm-hmm.
and just like take a little bit of time to introspect within yourself. Why do things feel different?
how did
Mm-hmm.
Anton describe it?
Anton
It was
described it.
it was a
Yeah.
pixel perfect city.
Yeah. One of the designers in our guild described Tokyo as a
Yeah.
pixel perfect city, which is yes, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I
Why?
think travel in general is such a wonderful way to just kind of reset your expectations and understand that like not everybody you design for is going to have the same background as you, or experiences or environment as you. If you're building a product that's going to be used around the world. So yeah, I think it's great.
Where do you find that you're getting a lot of your inspiration these days? Because I mean, you are someone that is so prolific in this world. Like you come across, I'm sure people are now sending you things versus you going after things. But are there any secret places that we should know about where
Mm.
you're pulling inspiration, or is it everything from like, the surfing to the photography that you do on the side?
Yeah, gosh, if I gave away the secrets, it wouldn't be secret anymore.
That's okay.
Yeah.
We have like most.
No, I'm trying to think if there's places I go regularly. Honestly, this will sound weird, like being a designer, but one of my favorite places to go to learn, just to check out new things, is Hacker News. I'm there. I go there all the time, and a lot of it's technical and not as interesting to me. But then there's, oftentimes random things that are just really cool and creative, and often, but not always, the comments are pretty intelligent. Sometimes a little, facetious and fractious, but um, less so than a lot of the internet kind of forums that you find yourself on. So that's one place I go often for inspiration. Um, yeah, and then just in the course of interviewing people for our show, we almost always end with like, "What's inspiring you right now?" And so, if I'm talking to an Ed Catmull or David Sedaris, although I don't think we had a chance to ask him that question, I'm curious to see like what's really inspiring them. Actually, he did mention a writer named Susan Orland, but what's inspiring to them right now, and that's sort of a kind of a constant way to get new things in my life.
Incredible. Incredible. And so like, okay, I do want to also like um examine a little bit more like this journey that design's like gone on. You know, all of us have sort of brought up in different ways like the last decade and sort of uh the role of the iPhone and mobile in maybe it may end up being that besides like sort of continuous connected compute is like causing a design awakening among so many people. Um you mentioned how like when you were working at Envision that there was this the library for like design education, which I think like given when Envision really like sort of came on the scene, like it makes a lot of sense why like that would have been like a natural dovetail with like what the community that Envision was trying to serve needed. Like, can you tell me a little bit about how you've seen that community, the design community in tech itself, sort of like evolve since like Envision started, and like where you think things are now versus where they were when like Envision really was like one of the first design startups, right? Where it's
Yeah.
about design. It's not like Photoshop, which is design was this narrow use case across so many other applications.
Yeah.
Envision was, I feel like, the first startup that really came on the scene and was like, we're about
And it
design.
spoke to the tech world for the very
Yeah,
first time.
exactly.
Similarly, like to how like Figma comments spoke to people in tech teams outside of the design department.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think they were one of the first, and I was certainly a fan. Before I joined the company, I was using them for my own work, and I liked, the simplicity of their approach. And I think, one thing that has involved, which we've already touched on a little bit, is let's say rewind to 2011. A lot of companies out there hadn't really fully understood the value of design. They sort of saw it as a bolt on at the end, like, okay, we'll build
Mhm.
this product and we'll bring the designers in and they'll make it look good, at the very end,
You
which
look good.
which is kind of the opposite ideally of the approach you want to take, where you start with the idea of we're gonna we're gonna build a prototype, we're gonna understand like who we're building this for, build a prototype, iterate on that. That's it shares some things with like a lean startup approach. Honestly, there's a lot of overlap there, but this idea of kind of building and learning and iterating, that's core to the whole design thinking, design sprint methodologies. And I think I would say back then that wasn't a super common thing outside of the kinds of tech companies that had already at that point embraced design. I think by then Google was already starting to embrace design. We've had Irene Au, and she's a friend and has taught with me before, but she was one of Google's first like real design leader hires. And when she talked to, I can't remember if it was Larry or Sergey, one of them, she was like, "What's your ideal user experience?" And he's like, Pine. And Pine, if you don't remember it, which you might not, was like a Unix-based terminal for which I used back in the day to access my email back in the '90s, just command line interface. She's like, "That's the optimal user experience." She's like, "Huh, okay, I can see why you think that way. It's very efficient, but honestly, there's not a ton of people outside your engineering crowd that are going to agree with you there." So they had to understand that, like, yes, there's efficiency. Efficiency is very important, but there's plenty of people out there who need more affordances, need to understand. They don't care so much about the density of information as like the hierarchy and importance. Like my screen could be filled top to bottom with my Gmail and subject lines, and that's very efficient and a good use of space. But gosh, it's hard to pick out like what are the important emails here, or read through them and things like that. So even he started to understand and embrace things like white space and other kind of design fundamentals, and the company headed more in that direction. But again, this is, let's say, 2010, 11-ish. Companies, if you're talking to like a healthcare company or a bank or any of these other large institutions, they were just like, design, what we have a design team that they design our brochures for us. What more do we
Yeah.
need it for? So they just didn't
What
really
more do
get
we need?
it. So I think that's been a big change over the last decade or so.
Like just I guess we could just use Google as an example. When Mateus Duarte kind of came on the scene, and he introduced this notion of material, it had seemed very reactionary in the design world. It had seemed as almost as if Google was playing catch up,
Mm-hmm.
to the likes of like Apple or something. What do you think it is that a company can do to avoid reactions in the discipline versus just having it baked in and then building it up, similarly to like what Apple has been successful at doing?
It's challenging because I think some companies have that in their DNA. With Apple, obviously Steve Jobs, that was very a core part of his identity. It was understanding design and why it's important. Um, then you look at going back to the Google example. These are two very technical co-founders who value efficiency and speed, and design at first was very much a secondary consideration, but eventually started to buy into it. And I think it's tough. I think part of it is just going to be this fact, which we've talked about, that essentially design is to some degree becoming commoditized. Like, right, like almost any kind of app you create now is going to be on top of some sort of framework or design system. Maybe not a specific system for a specific app, but a good interface is almost like table stakes these days. Like, you're not going to go throw something out in front of users that's just that's unreadable, unusable. Those types of things are just commodities, really. So when you're talking about, I guess, the finer points of design and how do you build that into your brand, I don't know if there's one easy answer, and it kind of depends on the type of product you're doing. But I think having your leadership understand this sort of strategic value of having design being a part of your product team's process from the very beginning, as opposed to something bolted on at the end. I think that's a place to start.
Yeah, well said.
That makes a lot of sense. Well, then what do you think what do you think are the minimum environmental conditions required for a sort of well-run, wholesome, sincere, and impactful like design thinking process? The reason I ask this is from the perspective of like the startup founder
Mm-hmm.
who is just getting started, right? So they're oftentimes very resource constrained. I think regardless of their actual social class, you could say that they're paying a poverty tax in the sense that like their runway is so tight that they're
Mm-hmm.
probably constantly thinking about it in a way that actually may like um, uh, obstruct clarity of thought,
Yeah.
right? And like how you were saying like the that contrived process of trying to find a problem to solve and going out to talk to a bunch of people and aggregating to see if like there's something there,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Which oftentimes just gets chalked up to, I want to be part of the design process, but it takes too damn long,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
because it does take a long
it
time.
does. Yeah, yeah. So like, I mean, what do you think are the minimal conditions necessary? Let's say from sort of like the perspective of like a startup or a startup founder to be able to like actually have like thoughtful design thinking
Yeah.
part of their process.
Yeah, and I think there's maybe something of a misconception that design has to be super resource intense or take a lot of time, or you have to hire expensive people to help you with it. But if you look at like what Jake Knapp and others did it with at Google Ventures with Sprint, they really condensed the process down into like a week long thing that you can experiment with. So are you all familiar with the Sprint book and
Of
Sprint
course, yeah.
Sure.
process? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, take a week, run an experiment. Yes, a week is valuable if you're a startup and you have limited runway, but it's not an exorbitant amount of time, especially if you're feeling like you're in an area where you're stuck or there's some sort of existential risk to the product that you're sort of on the verge of taking. I think that kind of approach where you're, again, quickly building prototypes, getting feedback and input can be helpful, and sort of show the value of design in a really tangible way. Um, there are other ways I think to build, design into your team's process, but I think those little steps can be a really, easy way to just get started with it.
Kind of taking a right turn here, but what gives you fulfillment these days in the discipline? Because I don't,
Hmm.
I mean, are you still designing, or do you find yourself getting fulfillment from other places?
Yes, so I still love making things, and though a lot of my work right now is as a podcaster, there's a lot of kind of design and experimentation and creation that happens along the way. So I think over time too, I've realized that I really enjoy writing, and so writing is part of my kind of creative fulfillment, creative endeavors. We have a newsletter and other written things along with the show script that I do. But yeah, going back to like some of the AI tools we're talking about, I'm just having so much fun exploring all these things. I just did a talk here recently for Creative Mornings that was just sort of about what are all the all the fun things that you can do and experiment with these new tools that are on the way. And so um, even even things that are kind of mundane, like um, I'm doing some consulting work and I just needed to track my time, and so I had ChatGPT help me write a plugin for a calendar that just tracks time on this project, essentially, which is kind of
Love
stupid
that.
and silly, but it's like that's fun. It's fun to make things, and I think I as a I guess you could sort of loosely call that design, but really what gets me excited is just making things. And then to get even sillier, like I've gotten into like doing kind of elaborate Halloween costumes over the last few
Oh,
years, and I'm
awesome.
I'm working. I just finished, or I'm finishing. Like I'm doing a Viking costume with like a Viking shield, where I watched this YouTube video on this guy who does it. So silly stuff like that I enjoy, and just kind of fulfills the creative itch.
Okay, what's the
So,
I
this
I
explains the beard.
Right. Yeah, I've been
yeah.
working on this for 3 years, and then finally I can have the costume to make it work.
Wait, so okay, and now I have many questions
Mm-hmm.
around your Halloween costume praxis.
Mm-hmm.
Like what's the zaniest or like what's the wildest Halloween costume from the last like 4 or 5 years that you pulled off?
Yeah. So it's funny, having kids, and my oldest is 12 and my younger one's 8, and so in their early years, I didn't really dress up. We kind of dressed them up in cute costumes, and I didn't do it. But as they got older, I started to get more into it. I think my first sort of real costume investment was a pirate costume like 4 or 5 years ago, and that sort of built up over time. I made it more elaborate. Then I switched over to last year was more of like a knight, and actually got chainmail, which is super freaking heavy, as you might imagine. And I got a,
What?
yeah, so totally nerdy. And as someone who grew up playing like Dungeons and Dragons and things like that, I always had kind of a fascination with knights and armor and silly stuff like that. But kind of fun to enact it in your middle age, and also make stuff like I said with a Viking costume.
So, okay, so do you like when you're in the blueprinting phase of putting the costume together,
Mm-hmm.
like it sounds like no matter what, you're going hard. It's just like is the question here like or is the way that you go hard like you go into like the archives and try to understand, for example,
Mm,
like were they using birch or ash for
right.
for the shield planks or like
Like, do you apply your design
yeah.
prowess to the costume making process?
Yeah, well, I try a bit. So let me see if I can show you a photo here.
If not,
Um, I don't know if this is going to come up, but oh gosh, if I
Okay,
check. So
that's real decorated shield.
yeah, so I found some sketches of like a
Whoa.
Celtic squid or something weird like that, and I made the shield again. I looked at a YouTube video of some dude that makes Viking shields, I guess. And yeah, I looked at the historical accuracy, like how big were they actually, and like things like that. But I never get too crazy on the materials, just because I don't want to like spend hundreds of dollars unnecessarily on things that I'm going to use for one day. But yeah, it's fun. It is kind of like it is a bit of a design outlet, a bit of a making outlet. I like building stuff around the house too. So a tree fort built for the kids during the pandemic and some other things. But yeah, I think often, I'm sure, as you guys know, if we're kind of see ourselves as designers and makers and creators, it doesn't have to be a product that we're working on that gets us fired up. It can be other things too. So yeah.
speaking of that, like, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this notion of, because I certainly believe this, it's not, it doesn't stop at just designing a product or an interface. I'm actually a true believer that you can design relationships,
Mm.
you can design your character, you can
Mm-hmm.
design questions, the way that you think. You know, what else can you design? What are you designing today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many. I mean, one of the fellows I teach with, is writing a series of books. The first one is called Designing Your Life, and then he was Designing Your Work Life, and then there's another one he's working on at the moment. But I think you can essentially take a design approach to pretty much everything in your life. I think the one that I've used the most, if you're sort of like bucketing it out into like understanding people and empathy and research and the prototyping and testing is like taking a prototyping approach where I will, if I'm interested in like shifting my career somewhere else, I would prototype it in a kind of small way and say, oh, this is interesting, and then invest more in it. Teaching was an example of that, where I knew that at some point I wanted to teach, but I thought, well, maybe it'd be closer to when I'm retired, but I should probably try it because I might I might hate it. And so I started as a coach in the program where I teach now, and I liked it enough, and they asked me to come, help out more with the class as a lecturer. So sometimes I think, yeah, taking a designer's mindset of like, what's sort of like the minimum viable version of this that I can try and prototype has been helpful.
I love that.
Yeah. Yeah. And so like you're getting ready to go out and surf. So I got to ask the question, like
Hmm.
do you see any connection between what you describe as your lifelong ocean worship and the design process?
Hmm. Yes, I think, paying attention and just sort of be prepared for the unknown, essentially. Those are two things. If you're surfing, and I also free dive, but you have to be pretty aware of your surroundings because there's some amount of hazard involved, and certainly if you want to be an okay surfer, you have to kind of know how to predict like where to be, where to position yourself, and also sort of be obviously aware of the environmental conditions and forecasting and things like that. So just paying attention to things and being observant, that certainly carries over. And then there's a lot of unknowns involved in these things. Like, where is it gonna be good today? Like, I might go out, it might be terrible, it might be great, but just being kind of open to the unknown and the unexpected and serendipity. I think that's also helpful when you're designing things too, because inevitably there's gonna be challenges thrown your way that you didn't expect.
Totally. I mean, one of the things I think about that like is a principle I often find across many different disciplines where uh, design is noticeable, or its absence is noticeable, let's say, uh, is knowing your material.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I think when you describe like, surfing, or freediving, both cases, right? It's like it's not just like knowing what ocean is like,
Hmm.
right? But like, the time of the day, like what's the tide like, how deep is the water? I mean, so many different things. I'm not a surfer, so obviously like you can tell this is sort of like I don't know the 30 words for snow, but but like if you're gonna design it or you're gonna interface with it, you have to, right? And this was a thing that we actually saw in our days at Clara, where like we would see these like designs come up that maybe didn't have full awareness of the limitations with the React library at the time,
Mm.
and the things that were possible for React to like sort of pull off with the way that it manipulated objects in the DOM, that were trivial to pull off with mobile native, right? So I don't know. That's the other thing I'd say is like, yeah, knowing your material seems like a big deal when you're designing or surfing.
Yeah, knowing the medium, the material, being open to serendipity, being curious, all important.
I always find it fascinating when, I grew up as a camp counselor, for several years. And it was always interesting whenever I was teaching like the arts and crafts uh, class because it was everyone's favorite class,
Hmm.
right? That and recess was everyone's like favorite period
That's my
of the
son's
day.
favorite. Yeah, recess.
Yeah. So like, Johnny Ive, John Maida, Alan Dye, like these are like serious pros, right? Like they're gonna have their own definition of what design is to them today, right? How are you teaching it to your kids?
Hmm.
Because I had imagined that, you know, with you as their father, it's a very different interpretation of design versus like, a muggle child, you know.
uh, I kind of consider myself a muggle in many ways, but I think that uh, I I don't really talk to them too much specifically about design, but I do really encourage creativity and, like you said, just playing and like drawing. And my daughter's really taking it up. Like she draws a ton. She makes things. She when she was a little younger, and still a bit, but she made these amazing like little like miniature clay figurines, like a furniture set the size of a dime. There's like how do you have the fine motor control to make these little objects? It's amazing. Uh, and my son Dash, he's kind of into it, but he it just goes to show you how kids, even if you raise them in sort of similar environments, will turn out very different. Dash, and we might have known this by naming him Dash, but he's very very physical, running around all the place. He loves playing wall ball at school. It's inevitably the thing that he talks about that was his favorite part of the day. So he's less. I mean, I guess he's creative in his own way. He loves his color and sketch and stuff, but I don't see him maybe as invested in that as Phoebe is. And that's okay to me. I don't want to force my kids in any certain direction. I want them to have the opportunity to try that and to just, and also because I see is that that's sort of part of our human future really lies in our creativity and our human touch, even if we do have kind of an AI helper. Um, but yeah, I don't have a specific rubric or syllabus for getting them in a direction that I want them to go. I just want them to be able to try a lot of different things.
Yeah, and I had an inkling that you were going to say you just try to encourage their creativity, which leads me to my next question is like, well, how do you teach an adult how to be creative?
Hmm.
What advice would you have for people that are design curious?
Hmm. A big part of it is just getting over the fear and developing, my advisor and guy I look up to a lot in our program, Dave Kelly. He wrote this whole book called Creative Confidence, which if you're in that space and you're curious about design, but have a little feel that you aren't creative, it's a good read because, like you said, Harrison, the kids that you teach, everybody, all the kids, almost indefinitely, almost without exception, are there drawing and painting and making things with clay. Like there's nobody like standing to the side saying, I don't get this, or this is boring, or I'm afraid to do this. Up to a certain age, at which point they become more self-conscious, and certain kids get identified as creative and some don't, and that sort of reinforces itself, unfortunately, through our education system, which I think has a lot of inherent problems with it. But the creative kids get separated out from the non-creative ones, and all of a sudden you find yourself self-identifying as a not a creative person when we all
Yeah.
started out in a very creative place to begin with. So yeah, I think part of it, it's less about becoming creative and more about regaining the creative sort of freedom that you had as a kid and understanding that, look, Picasso, as much as he's regarded as this, master artist, it took him hundreds of thousands of works to get to where he is.
Yeah.
If you look at his
Yeah.
painting repertoire, it's something like 14,000 paintings, 100,000 pieces overall, and only a fraction of those were really considered masterpieces, right? So a big part of being creative is just creating a big volume of things. And it's not going to be great to begin with. It's going to suck for the most part when you're just getting started. That's okay. That's part of the process. And part of the goal should just be enjoying the process for its own sake.
So it's almost like putting yourself in a position as an adult where you're you have to explore your own creativity. It's almost like reparenting yourself in a way,
Mm-hmm.
to kind of like unlock that inner child. And I think like a lot of the founders that we speak to, day in and day out, like they struggle with that.
Mm-hmm.
They struggle, and I think it's something that kind of eats them up inside because they look at maybe where their startup started, where it got its start from, and they ask themselves like, well, how can I get that innovation back? How can I get that creativity back? How can I like stimulate my imagination to think along those lines again? And you know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what would your reaction be to that problem? If you're talking to a founder and they were talking that way, like what would be your reaction to that?
So the problem they're coming with is like, I I've lost my creativity, or I feel like I've never been creative, or
Yeah, they were put into a bucket like you said.
yeah,
Maybe like 12, 13.
I'm not a designer.
Yeah.
I'm not a designer. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think it just comes down to just trying things, and it doesn't have to be directly related to what you're working on at work either. It can be other creative endeavors. If you wanted to like learn an instrument, if you wanted to paint watercolors, just to try it, like trying different forms of creativity will kind of inevitably open up that space in your brain to think of yourself as more creative. So yeah, it can be work related. It can be related to what you're doing with your startup or your product. But I'd say it's also probably equally valuable to try it in other arenas, and then you can bring it back to what you're doing.
Yeah, so just trying,
Mm-hmm.
and creating volume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, yeah, that's a beautiful end note if you ask me. Like, I don't know, Eli, is there anything else that you wish that the type of people who get into entrepreneurship and get into startups, you wish they heard, like a message that you would like want to leave them with?
I'm trying to get beyond anything cheesy, like make the world a better place. And my mind flashes back to like HBO Silicon Valley, and it was a
Totally.
Gavin Belson saying like, I don't want to be in a world where somebody else makes the world a better place than we do. um, I don't know whether that last true, but um, I think one thing to take away is just there's value in making stuff for other people, and there's value in caring about what you're doing when you're making things for other people. My co-host and I just recorded this episode. It was kind of a new experiment, a sponsored episode for this brand, American Giant. Happened to be wearing their shirt, and they're
Mm.
really interesting company where their values, I think, are very aligned with what they do. They're trying to bring back manufacturing to smaller towns in America, and um, in the course of the conversation, my co-host Aaron and I were talking about this book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and there's this idea there about quality and kind of caring,
Great book.
yeah, caring about what you do in a deep sense, and understanding that there's kind of a responsibility that you take in making something and giving it out to the world. So yeah, I think caring about what you do, caring about quality, those are important things for founders to think about.
Very true.
Thank you so much for coming on. Like, we know you're a super busy guy. Like, this is such a treat. And yeah, just thank you for your time, man.
Yeah, we're so grateful that we got to talk to you.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, I appreciate you having me here, and hopefully it's helpful to your guests, hopefully to your audience.
Oh,
Yeah.
definitely, definitely.